Hello, everyone. My name is Anna Bauman. I produce Nerdette, and it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's program, Table for Two with Amor Towles and Greta Johnsen, in this live Nerdette book club format. Before we begin, I have a few announcements. First, programs like this one are made possible by people like you. The mission of public media is more important than ever, so thank you for your support. Also, WBEZ has some great events coming up this summer. That includes a special summer vacation edition of Mortified Live on May 18, and a handful of summer concerts, including Vocalo's summer finale at Millennium Park later this summer. Find tickets and details at wbez.org/events. Also, a big thank you to our captioner tonight, Zeke, for making this program more accessible. And thank you to our book partner, Bookends and Beginnings. Celebrating its 10th anniversary in June, Bookends is one of the 50 independent bookstores that make Chicagoland a vibrant destination for book lovers. Please remember that independent bookstores survive because of the committed support of folks like all of you. So if you love what you hear tonight, visit the book sales table in the lobby to find copies of all of Amor Towles' books after the show. Now, the reason we're all here, tonight's author has seen his work hit multiple New York Times bestseller lists, including his latest, Table for Two. The book includes 6 short stories and a novella, which we'll explore over the course of the next hour. So please, put your hands together for Amor Towles and Nerdette host, Greta Johnsen.
Thank you.
Amor, welcome to Chicago.
Thank you. It's good to be here in Chicago. Thanks for having me.
Yay. So, as Anna mentioned, this event is it's essentially a live taping of Nerdette Book Club, which we're really excited about because we've never done that before. So that means we are going to pull back the curtain a little bit and we'll have some audience engagement this evening. So when I read this intro in a second and I say, hi, everyone, I'm going to need y'all to clap and cheer and holler as loudly as you possibly can. Can you do that for me? Okay, great. From WBEZ Chicago, I'm Greta Johnsen, and this is the Nerdette Book Club. It's just like a regular book club, except sometimes it is in front of a live audience at the Athenaeum Theater in Chicago. Hi, everyone.
Hey!
That is a very good crowd. I am so excited for tonight's event. Here on stage with me is the Amor Towles. He is the author of The Lincoln Highway and A Gentleman in Moscow, which is one of my all-time favorite books. And it was also recently made into a TV series on Paramount+. His most recent book is, as we can see right here, Table for Two. It is a collection of 6 different short stories. And there is a novella, which is based on characters from his first novel, Rules of Civility. That is all I am going to say for now, since we want to keep this as spoiler-free as possible this evening. But I just want to let y'all know as well that we did collect questions from you in the audience ahead of time, so I'm really excited to kind of sprinkle those through the conversation. Amor, welcome to Nerdette.
Thank you. It's good to be here. And thank you for doing this tonight.
Oh my gosh, thank you. Such a pleasure. So how does it feel to have a new book out in the world?
Oh, it's always satisfying. I mean, because I work over a period of years to create a work of fiction, and so it always is nice to sort of send it out into the world. It's a satisfying feeling for sure.
There is a character in one of the early stories in this book who lets out a sigh of sentimental satisfaction. And it was so fun to hear that phrase because I think that is exactly what your work evokes for me.
Thank you.
So I wonder, you've written short stories, you've written novels, you've written a novella. Is there a sweet spot for you in terms of not only, using your writerly muscles, but also getting to explore a topic? Or do you think each satisfies different cravings for you?
Okay. So, and I'll start with this. I began writing fiction as a kid, and I think like a lot of novelists, I trained in the short story. That's the way I think most novelists begin, and it makes sense because since the short story is short, it allows you as an emerging artist to experiment with all the different elements of craft. So you would kind of go from story to story to story, taking a different approach to the tone, a different approach to the point of view, a different approach to using metaphor or illusion or allegory, a different approach to dialogue and setting. And every story, you kind of approach it differently, and through that, over time, you kind of hopefully are beginning to master the craft, so that if you end up writing a novel, you can draw on all those experiences to construct the novel in the way that best suits that story. But I think that it's kind of interesting, having written 3 novels and then returned to the short story over the last 10 years, that all these stories in this collection were written in the last 10 years. I have thought a lot about the difference, both for me as a writer and potentially for you as the reader. And so I want to share that with you. And before I do that, I should say that when I was in high school, my English teacher, Dick Baker, was a great hero of mine, a big mentor. He was a great intellect. He was the one who taught all of us how to read with a pen thoughtfully and how to dissect how a narrative worked. He was the one who we learned how to write serious essays for, using evidence and thesis statement and all that. And when you would hand in a paper, he would mark it all up and hand it back. And when my papers would come back, the most common comment in the margins was the initials SUG. And what that stood for was sweeping, unsupported generality.
So that's when you knew you wanted to be a writer.
Yeah, well, because he meant that as a criticism, go figure. So, but anyway, so here comes a sweeping, unsupported generality for you, Chicago, from me. So, my sweeping, unsupported generality on the difference between the novel and the short story is that I think when a writer is writing a novel, either consciously or unconsciously, the writer is very interested and focused on orientation in, say, the first 50 pages of that work. Because it's so important for you, the reader, to be oriented when you're entering into the adventure of a novel. So the author, consciously or unconsciously, is trying to give you a lot of information, such as, where does this take place? When and what does that mean? When does this take place? Who are the key figures? What might have been some events in the recent past which are going to have bearing on what comes next? What are some of the personality traits that are going to ultimately influence the actions to come? And maybe even some of the imagery that may end up being motifs that play out through the course of the story, some foreshadowing of the ultimate, culminating events. All this is going to be laid out pretty early in the book. And in fact, if you go back and read the first, say, 20 pages of your favorite novels with this lens, I think you'd be amazed at how much information is tucked in there in a way that is probably very unobtrusive, but yet is very informative. And as I say, this is very important because as a reader, if you did not, 30, 40, 50 pages in, you didn't know where it was happening, when it was happening, who it was happening to, you'd be like,
no, thank you.
Yeah, no thanks, And because you want the reader to feel sort of a sense of position and place, because that's how, from there, that the reader can begin to follow how the events unfold, how the characters evolve, how the themes accumulate. So that's a very important thing in novels. This does not exist in the short story. Mm-hmm. Right? So the whole short story may only be 15 pages. Mm-hmm. So you don't have the time as the writer to lay out all this information to orient the reader in this fashion. Instead, you really have to drop right in. And so, and that's a great pleasure, by the way, for the writer, and hopefully it's a great pleasure for the reader, right? Which is that as soon as you start, there's a conversation. It's taking place in a kitchen. But wait, I don't know quite when or where. Wait, where is this happening? I think it's a husband and wife. No, there's something happened the night before. They're fighting about it. Wait, and who's Tony? Like this is what we're doing as we're reading the short story, and that's it's sort of exciting because you can also, as you're piecing together quickly what's sort of happening, you also can sense it's running out of time. There's only 6 pages left. There's only 5 pages left. There's only 4 pages left, and so it's not going to be all laid out for you. And so it's an invitation to come in and witness a moment with minimal information, minimal preparation, for you to observe as closely as you can, and then for it to be over, and then for you to have the opportunity to sort of imagine and speculate how this moment in time could have influenced the next 50 years in the lives of these characters. And so, as I say, I think this is a big difference, and I think that, going back to your question, it's not that I prefer one to the other. I think that the two different writing forms offer different pleasures to me as the writer, and I hope different pleasures to you all as the readers.
That makes a lot of sense. It's funny because I think it took me a long time to come to appreciate a short story. I think for a long time I kind of thought either I'm not very into this, in which case why am I bother reading it, or I loved it, in which case why isn't it a whole ass book? But I love the way you've laid that out, because I think when they're done really well, as in this collection, they end up just being these like perfect, tasty little morsels, and it's exactly the amount of flavor you want, and then you get to move on and enjoy another one.
Yeah, I hope that's right.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think also in terms of craft and structure, there are a lot of really interesting things you can do, especially with a series of short stories in a collection like this. And I really loved, I think you could argue probably that every story in here has a secret at its core, which I imagine has to be extremely narratively enticing to write. Obviously, it's very enjoying to read, but I'm curious how that, if that was always part of the plan, or if they all just sort of ended up emerging with that similar concept.
Yeah, that's interesting. I did not think of that in a self-conscious way, but I do think that as a writer, I do love discovery. So, and I think it's, as a reader, I love it. I love learning from reading. I love going through a novel and going through the process of discovery, of sort of understanding what's going on, say, between the key characters, or what the greater themes might be. And so I've always found it very, I enjoy creating characters and putting them in situations where, yes, they are going through discovery, and something has happened which they're not aware of, and they're beginning to figure it out or to piece it together, and it has ramifications for who they are. And so a secret, I guess, is an aspect of that bigger scope of sort of interest in how characters can see the world and discover things. I think for those of you who read my first novel, Rules of Civility, that's a first-person narrative. It's from the perspective of a 25-year-old woman of a working-class background named Katie. And I think that one of the best parts about that book, one of the strengths of it, is that she's a shrewd observer. She's a smarter observer than I am. And as she is going through sort of New York society and getting her first sort of foot in the door of sophisticated social life and professional life in Manhattan, she's just a really good observer of what's happening. And so that you kind of have that's a different kind of discovery. But that's fun for me to go along on the ride. What's she going to learn tonight? That kind of thing. And then hopefully that provides a certain kind of momentum and energy for the reader too.
I also enjoyed how many chance encounters there are in these. I think about, like, so many people end up sort of being shaken out of their daily routines because they happen upon someone and have a conversation that they just completely didn't expect, which I suppose also fits in the idea of discovery as well.
Well, and I also actually think that's it's very common to life in the case that we're talking about, which is that you take a train ride and you have a conversation with the person on the train. 9 out of 10 times, or even 99 out of 100, it doesn't amount to anything. But occasionally you're like, holy moly, that's an incredible story. And that's the one you go home and you're like, I had the craziest conversation on the train tonight, And so, but we also witness things sometimes, where whatever, a fight breaks out. Oh my God, and Susie and Betsy beat each other up, whatever. I don't know, making it up.
Betsy is
my
so
point is,
aggressive, isn't she?
Things do happen, right? Things do happen, and it is true that I think this collection, the 6 stories in New York in particular, are very often about a little thing that happens that the characters witness or they participate in tangentially, and it could be a small thing that would disappear, but it can also build, and it's sort of interesting when it's the kind of thing that, as small as it is, it could have ramifications for the characters involved, and affect in unanticipated ways how they treat each other, how they think of themselves, what they do next.
So not.
Can I linger on that?
Yeah.
Is that right? Because I thought I'd give you an example. So the New York stories are, the Lincoln Highway is totally an invention. Rules of Civility is an invention. A Gentleman in Moscow is an invention. The New York stories are all inventions. The characters are all made up. But they, more than the novels, may have sprung from a little something that I witnessed, a little thing. And so I'll give you an example. The first 5 pages of the story called The Bootlegger are probably the most autobiographical 5 pages that I've ever written. And I'll tell you what happens, because it's not a spoiler. I mean, it's because it's right there at the beginning. But in my early 30s, my wife and I, our kids were just sleeping through the night now, and so we were like, okay, it's time to have babysitters, and we'll let's go out once a week, and we're kind of at that phase of parenthood. And I read in the New York Times that Eugenie Kissin, who at the moment was really considered the greatest living piano player in the world, was coming to America for the first time, and he was going to premiere at Carnegie Hall. And I was like, oh, wow, that sounds pretty amazing. Honey, maybe we should do this. Maybe we should go to Carnegie Hall and see this, famous poet, famous piano player. Well, we like classical music, but we'd never been to Carnegie Hall before. We don't follow classical music closely. And so, but my wife was like, okay, yeah, that sounds like a good date. That's fine. Let's do that. So I call Carnegie Hall. And I say, hey, I'm interested in going to the Eugenie Kissin concert. I'd like to buy 2 tickets. And they're like, well, actually, the tickets are not available yet to the public. They're only available to patrons of Carnegie Hall. And I'm like, okay, so what's that mean? What does it mean to be a patron of Carnegie Hall? And they're like, well, it means that you make a donation. And I'm like, okay, well, like how much of a donation? So they tell me the number, and I'm like, okay, I'll do that. I'll make the donation. So, we give the credit card number. I am now a patron, and I say, okay, now as a patron, I would like to buy 2 tickets to Eugenie Kissin. And the person says, well, it's actually not that simple, because at this stage, patrons are only allowed to buy concerts when they're a part of a series. I'm like, okay, what's a series? They're like, well, like for instance, we're having, this series of 4, great piano players, and Eugenie Kissin is one of the 4, and if you buy the series, yeah, you get to go. And so like, so now, like, I'm committed.
You're
right?
all in. How can you not be?
I am committed.
You're
right?
going.
I'm like, okay, we're in for the series, My wife is like sitting, rolling her eyes. She's like, for this price, we could have had our date in Paris.
I do think it's worth noting at this point also that the story is told from the point of view of the wife.
Of the wife, that's true. That's true. Yeah, so you get the eye roll firsthand. So anyway, so we get that series, and Eugenie Kissin is the second performance. So we go to the first performance, we dress up, we go to a fancy restaurant, and we come to Carnegie Hall, we have nice seats and everything. And the way that works in Carnegie Hall is that if you subscribe to a series, you have the same seat for every night. And in fact, you have the right to purchase that seat every year in perpetuity as long as you don't stop. Okay. So many of the people in Carnegie Hall at the series are in the same seat that they've been in for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. So we're sitting there, and just before the performance begins, this old guy in a trench coat comes in, and he passes us, and he sits next to me. We go, hello, hello. And suddenly, he puts his arm on the rest, and as Eugenie Kissin comes out on stage, I realize that there's 2 little black stems sticking out of the trench coat sleeve, and I realized, oh my God, the old guy is recording the concert. I could not believe it. I could not get over it. And I'm like nudging my wife, and she's like, shh, So at any rate, so we go through the concert, and I'm like, wow, I just still couldn't believe that. Like when we were on the cab home, I'm talking about it. So then we come the next week, and it's Eugenie Kissin now. And so we sit, fancy dinner, sit. Sure enough, just as Kissin's about to come on stage, the old guy comes in, he sits down, he's got his recording device all set up to go, and I could not get over it. So I began to fantasize about turning him into security, I'm like imagining, right? Yes, officer, it's him. Officer, I don't even know.
I saw him.
Yeah. You search him. Like what I don't know. So so this is my fantasy, but I'm all wrapped up in my indignation about it, my moral indignation, and having this fantasy, and I don't. Of course, I don't do it. But what ends up happening is that the next morning, and I remember this very vividly, the New York Times reports that that Eugenie Kissin at this concert received the longest standing ovation in recent memory at Carnegie Hall. And I don't remember him playing. Right? Because I spent the whole night wired up, Anyway.
Oh my God.
So then, years go by, decades go by, whatever, and then you're like, I was like, what I do is I often will write short stories in between novels. Because I love being here in Chicago, love seeing you, but it's very hard to be writing a novel when I'm doing this kind of thing. It's very disruptive, and you want, for a novel, I really want a big open runway, no interruptions, lots of time, so I can get myself immersed. So what I'll do in moments like this is write short stories. So maybe it was after Gentleman Moscow, I was like, oh yeah, I'm on the road, maybe I'll write a short story, and I was like, oh, that would be interesting, maybe let's go back to that event, which at that point was 20 years before the Carnegie Hall event. And what if the guy actually went and got security? Like, what would happen, And so that's what happens in that story. It's a full imagination of what if.
Whew. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much.
So I had the great pleasure of listening to the audiobook of this collection.
Yeah.
And you mentioned The Bootlegger, which is narrated by the J. Smith Cameron, who, of course, many
Yes.
people know of as in Succession.
Jerry, the lawyer in
Yes,
Succession.
Jerry
yeah.
in Succession.
Yeah, she's terrific.
Yes, that is an appropriate reaction.
Yeah.
How on earth did you get her as the narrator? Were you a part of that conversation at all?
Well, yes, I am involved in choosing the narrators for my books. But in that case, what ended up happening is she and I met through social media. It's one of, occasionally, mostly social media. We all know what mostly social media gives you, but occasionally, occasionally gives you something great. And it was, she reached out and she's like, oh, I just read, John Moscow, I loved it so much. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm a big fan of Succession. And then it turned out we both live in New York City, and then it turned out we both drink martinis, and so bam,
Beautiful.
The rest was history. So anyway, so we would have fun, get together, have a martini lunch. She's like the only person I have martini lunches with, by the way. but we do it. And so when this book was being put together, and I knew we had chosen Eduardo Ballerini, who's really one of the great audiobook readers in the country. He had done the majority of Lincoln Highway, and so he was up for doing Table for Two, and I was like, terrific. But this one story in the collection is from, as Greta mentions, is from a woman's perspective, from the wife. And I didn't want Eduardo to read that. And I immediately thought, oh, you know what? Jay would kill this. She's really, her tone is so right for it. And so I reached out, and she said I would love to do it. And I love Eduardo, but she's amazing in the story. She really does. She's a pitch perfect delivery in the piece, which is a lot of fun.
It's amazing. It was such a pleasure to listen to. So there is another short story in here called The Ballad of Timothy Touchett, and it's about a young man who aspires to be a great writer, but becomes a very great stealer of great authors' signatures.
Right.
And we actually got a question from the audience about this one. Barbara wanted to know what prompted you to include Paul Auster in that story as one of the forgery subjects.
Yeah.
And Barbara said, I loved how you wove the element of chance into the story, which is an important theme for Auster as well. And they were curious what you thought about that inclusion in the story.
Okay. So, this is this is a minor spoiler, which is that yes, in the Ballad of Timothy Touchett, Timothy, who is this a 25-year-old aspiring novelist, he's having trouble actually doing his work. He sort of begins copying the signatures of his heroes, and that turns out to be quite lucrative. And so, but so I kind of, in planning the story, and I'm a planner, and for a novel, what'll happen is I will start with an idea, a notion, very simple. Like guy gets trapped in a hotel for a long period of time. And that, I'm not kidding, that was it. I was walking into a hotel, and that was the idea that came to me. And so what happened there is, in the hotel room upstairs, I took out the hotel stationery, and really in an hour, I had sketched out most of the key events of A Gentleman in Moscow.
Wow.
Where it was, it'll be in Russia. It'll be an aristocrat sentenced to house arrest in the fancy hotel across the street from the Kremlin. He'll become a waiter. He'll fall in love with an actress. All that stuff. Then what will happen is if it intrigues me, I will then start to fill notebooks. Well, I try to figure out exactly what happens, chapter by chapter. Every event, every setting, all the characters, their backgrounds, their personalities, the tone, some of the descriptions. I just start filling notebooks until eventually I know the whole thing, and then I'll make an outline, and then I'll start to write the book. So it's this multi-year process, and for me. And then it takes me a couple of years to write the book once I've done all that design work. I call it design. But so short stories is the same thing, it's just briefer, so that I still might have an idea, and the idea could be a decade old, it could be 20 years old, it could be 5 years old, but then I've dwelled on it, where I'm like, this would happen, this would happen, this would happen. It doesn't take me long to, I won't have to fill notebooks, but I might fill some pages. This is the key things that are going to happen in the short story. Then I might do an outline, but where in a novel my outlines are 50 pages, the outline for a short story might be 2 pages. 10 bullet points or something. And then I go in the process of writing it. So I lay all that out because in the story of Timothy Touchett, I know what's going to happen. And just like I know everything's going to happen in a novel when I start to write it. But what I had was, I wanted this I had this idea, what's going to happen is late in this story, one of the authors where he has forged a signature is going to discover a book with his signature. And be like, oh, that's nice, one of my books I've signed. But then be like, wait a second, does that look like my signature? Kind of you'd have this moment. And I was sort of like, so who would that be? And so I've planned that out, but I haven't really figured out yet who it's going to be. And so then you get kind of closer to actually writing the story. And then suddenly you're kind of paced the room sort of in a way. Could it be so-and-so? Would it be so-and-so? What would it be? And then suddenly I'm like, oh, Paul Auster, of course. Now, if you don't know Paul Auster's work, he's incredibly accomplished American writer. He's still alive today, although he's quite ill. But he's most famous for 3 relatively short books that were a trilogy called the New York Trilogy, and that are all slightly different stories that are connected. But in them, Paul Auster, as the writer, appears in one of the stories. And then there's, so in essence, Paul Auster is both the author, then Paul Auster's a character in one of the books, and then there's an imposter who pretends to be Paul Auster in one of the books.
Paul Auster imposter is pretty fun to say,
the Auster imposter. That's true. That's exactly right. So anyway, so you can see, I was like, oh, this is perfect. I was like, who would be better, than this, than Auster, who's created sort of artificial versions of himself, and because what allows the hero, Timothy, to say is, you know what, I bet he'd really dig this. Given the way he writes, he'd probably really appreciate the fact that someone was falsifying his signature. He does not appreciate it. So anyway, that's how come Auster ended up in the book.
So Anne wanted to know if you've thought about taking any of the short stories and turning them into novels, or is that less interesting to you given what you talked about earlier?
Usually when I have an idea for a story, meaning a story with indefinite length, I very quickly have a sense of how long I think it should be. And so I kind of know very quickly when it takes place, where it takes place, who it's going to happen to, what are the main events, and I mean like within an hour, and on that list is very quickly, oh yeah, this is going to be a story, or this should be a novel, and I can't pinpoint exactly what. Well, maybe I can. I think it's less why it's a short story, and it's more why it's not a novel. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is because when I have an idea for a novel, what has to happen for me is I have the notion and a little few ideas about it, and then I call it like, it's sort of a weird analogy, but I call it the opening of doors. And what I mean is that suddenly, as I'm thinking about the story, it's like I feel this great whooshing, as if I'm in a giant building and all the doors start opening. Because you're like, oh yes, this could happen. They could do that. He could go there. She could show up. It could be about this and that, and this trouble. And so something about certain ideas for me, like the Lincoln Highway or the Gentleman Moscow, I immediately can feel this sort of vastness of potential, and that's so critical if you're going to set out and write a novel where you want it to have to be layered, to be nuanced, to be multi-thematic, to be intricate. You wanted all these things. You want to know in advance that the story can provide that. You don't want to get 80 pages in and run out of rooms. You know what I mean? So I usually have that extent. I'm like, oh yeah, that's a novel. And when that doesn't happen, I'm like, oh, this is really nice, but it's not that sort of huge, multi-doored chamber. It's something smaller and more specific. And then, I don't think less of it. It becomes intriguing to me, but that shape is then dictated immediately.
That's fascinating. I love that. Okay, let's take a quick break, and then we'll be back with more with Amor Towles in just a minute. It's a fake break, y'all.
Okay.
Sorry.
I was like, wow, I've never had a break. Awesome.
Would you like a break?
Okay, I know.
All right, we are back with
Hey, we're
Amor
back.
Towles.
I wish I had changed outfits.
So, Amor, we can't not talk about the Paramount Plus adaptation of Gentlemen in Moscow. It just came out.
Thank you.
It's beautiful. How involved were you in it?
How involved was I? Well, I'll tell you this first of all.
Aside from writing the entire book, it's based on and everything.
Yeah, how involved. Yeah. My father used to have the same thing about the joke was that the difference between being involved and committed.
Ooh.
And the phrase was ham and eggs. And I think somebody said to him, it's ham and eggs. And he's like, what do you mean? He's like, well, it's are you involved or are you committed? And he's like, well, what does that have to do with ham and eggs? And he goes, well, with ham and eggs, the chicken's involved, but the pig is committed.
Oh.
So
That's delightful. Okay,
so anyway, so yeah, I'm committed.
So are you the chicken or the pig?
I'm the pig.
You're the pig?
Chicago. Yeah, I'm the pig. You know what I mean. So anyway, so what I was going to tell you. Oh yeah, so when okay, so this is kind of interesting. So you write the book, and then you're lucky enough. Someone says, "Hey, we want to option the book. We want to make it into a television series or what have you." The wheels start rolling, and the team starts to get built. And what ended up happening is, sort of deep into this, while the episodes are being written, I'm friends with Michael Lewis, and Michael Lewis, who wrote Moneyball and The Big Short and Blind Side. And so,
all of which were adapted.
All of which were adapted. So Michael is, on the one hand, an enormously successful nonfiction writer, but on the other hand is also very experienced in seeing his work translated into the visual medium. So we were having lunch, and he said, "Hey, how's the Gentleman in Moscow? The television series going? What's going on? What's happening?"
Were you drinking martinis?
No, he doesn't do that.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
No.
Sorry, just had to know.
I think it was strict. I think he might have been having a smoothie. No, I'm kidding.
Ooh,
I made that up.
I respect it.
I made that up. But, so he says, "Hey, so what's going on with the series? Tell me what's going on." And I said, "Well, they just sent me the first drafts of the first 3 episodes, and they've asked me for my feedback. But I think that they were just being polite." And there's a pause, and Michael says, "Amor, They were definitely just being polite. And in fact, not only do they not want to know what you think, they wish you were dead. That's true.
Damn, Michael
That is-
Lewis.
yeah, that's true. That's a true story. Anyway, but anyway, it wasn't as bad as all that. It wasn't as bad as all that for me. So what the deal was with me was that I received offers, or I received offers to do feature film. I said no. I'm only interested in being long-form television because it's a 30-year story, and I don't want it to be, crammed into the feature film structure. So then what happened is, as we began talking to people who wanted to do it, the series, the producers, in essence, what they said is, listen, Amor, you can't, you can't be like involved in every decision that's going to be made. This is, very complicated and, extended process and costs a lot of money and da. So here's what we'll do. You will be involved in hiring the director, hiring the writer, and hiring the lead actor and the lead actress. And in fact, when we're talking to a director that we think would be good, you will interview the director, and you will ask them what their vision is and about their work and what they think about the book. And at the end of that, if you say no, we move on. And if you say yes, then okay. And so that's the way it played out. And so I was involved in those. I did those interviews and had the chance to speak to the director and the head writer. I had the chance to be involved in choosing or making the offer to Ewan and to Mary Elizabeth Winstead. And so the producer said, listen, if you've been involved at that level, what we would hope is that you then trust the talented people to go and do what they've been trained to do, and that you'll step back, which was a very reasonable, I think, position, and so that's what I did. So it was then put together. Now, so I did visit the set a couple of times, and at this point you're a couple of years into the process, and it's a little nerve-wracking because I am the pig, and so so you're going to see what the chickens are doing with your breakfast. So you go in, and I arrive, and it's shot in Manchester, England, in a giant sound stage. And they say, listen, the director and the head writer, meet me outside, and they say, we want the set designer. He wants to introduce you to the set himself. This incredible guy, Victor. So he shows up, and so Victor talks to me about his vision and what he thinks about the book and what it meant to him and how he was trying to imagine it, and he says, so here, let's go. So we go into the stage set, and you're kind of walking past lumber and lights and, in essence, Teamsters or the British equivalent. And you kind of turn a corner, and there's the facade of the hotel. You're on fake cobblestone. There's the facade of the hotel. And he's like, okay, here we go. And we go through the revolving doors, and we enter the lobby. And I just remember very vividly being like, oh, everything's going to be fine. Because it was so beautiful and so detailed that, I was like, oh, these people are really putting it into it, and I'll give you some of this one little anecdote, which I wrote about on my website, or if you go to amortowles.com and you go to the contact page and you submit your email to me, then, you can send comments directly to me or questions, but you also then get my newsletter or whatever. So for those of you who are on that, you're going to recognize this quick story, which is that I'm in the lobby, and Victor has designed, it's a semicircular check-in desk, and behind the semicircular check-in desk is a cylindrical sort of tower with slots, which is where, like in this picture, it's the 1920s, it's where you would put your key, your tasseled key, when you came into the hotel, because you never carried your key out of a hotel in the old days. They'd put it there, and it's where mail would come, and telegrams, or what have you, because you use that address as your mailing address. And so he's built this beautiful cylindrical thing, and they're shooting a scene on the other side of the lobby, and they break. And I'm standing there behind the desk, because it's not in the scene, and I'm just waiting for the for the next shot. And I realize, look at half the slots or a third of the slots have mail. So I take out an envelope, and the envelope is heavy, like linen stationery. The address is in Cyrillic. It's in Russian Cyrillic, in fountain pen. There is a Soviet stamp, period stamp, and it's been postmarked, whatever, with a Soviet postmark. There's even a drop of ink where when the fountain pen was removed, a little drop landed on the thing, And then you realize, oh my God, every one of these envelopes in this thing is a handmade thing just like this, and you will never see them, like ever.
That's beautiful.
And so, and it tells you, like, wow, like this is how careful they are in trying to create some kind of sense of authenticity for you, but for the actors as well. That's part of what this tradition is about, is they want the actors to constantly feel like, I am here in this moment. And for those of you who haven't seen it yet, Ewan Gregor is amazing. It's really an incredible performance, really. And so they've had 5 of the 8 episodes have been released. I have not seen the final 3, but McGregor really does a towering job.
Yes. So yeah, Sally in the audience had wanted to know what you thought of it, but it sounds like you're really happy with how it has turned out as well.
Yeah. So and this is the reality. Of course, it's beautiful. It is incredibly well acted. It is very true to the heart of the story. Did they make changes? Yes. And so what happens, like my relationship to the changes is I'll just describe it to you, is like my wife and I are watching, like, say, episode 2 or 3 or something like that. And when we're watching and a scene occurs and it's word for word from the book, I'm like, oh, that's very good.
Uh-huh.
That's a really beautiful scene. And then like they'll change something and I start to fidget, I get a little edgy, a little antsy in my seat.
I don't know about
so
that.
we're watching it's like the 4th episode, I think, and the Count is talking to his childhood friend Mishka, and there's quite an emotional moment between the two of them, and it's not really what I had described in the book, but still quite heartfelt what's happening between them, and I'm beginning to get a little irked, and so I'm turning to my wife to express my moderate indignation. And she's crying. And I'm like, sweetie, I did not write that. And she's like, I know, but it's so beautiful.
There you
so
go.
you have that too, right? So yeah. I have to be like, okay, yeah, it kind of bugs me. But on the other hand, sometimes Ben Vanstone, who wrote, much of it and is the showrunner, sometimes he does it, he's right. That's what he approaches it from a different angle that has its own satisfactions. And so you have to be a little open-minded to the changes that come. But I think mostly you'll find that they've really gone out of their way, actors, set designer, costume, and Ben, to preserve much of what makes the work what it is.
Absolutely. So the book came out in 2016. I hadn't really come across it until, and I don't know how much the extent to which this happened for you in the audience as well, but it wasn't until 2020, when I was in isolation, that everyone started telling me about this book about a guy stuck in a hotel. And I was like, this is the last thing on earth I want to read right now. I'm living alone during a pandemic. And it wasn't until actually interviewing Tana French that year for her book, I believe it was The Hunter, that had come out in late 2020. And she was like, no, seriously, you have to read this book. And I did. I listened to the audiobook of that one as well. And I can still think about listening to that and remember like the long walks I would go on with my dog just through Ukrainian Village here in Chicago, and the deep comfort I got from that book during such a deeply unsettling time.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm glad.
Thank you.
Glad. Thank you very much.
I wonder, for you, how much did the pandemic really shift how people read that book? It must have, right? I can't be the only one.
Yeah, no, you're not the only one. I think the bigger picture related to, and to answer this question in the context of a bigger picture, I should say, is that there are some writers who really write, whose goal is to write to their times, and a lot of the best nonfiction is definitely that way, right? It's someone writing about race in America today, or what's happening in a polarized America, or what's happening in AI. It's the science that's evolving around us. What's happening to our youth? A lot of the best current nonfiction is looking at these issues, which are either emerging or have become significant or that have bearing. There are novelists who do that too, right? Who are kind of interested in really sort of taking their talent and focusing on something that is timely. And I am not. I'm really not. I am not. And I am much. I don't trust myself to write good, timely work, and I'm much more interested in writing work which is timeless. And so I'm always pushing back on the most urgent sort of things in our current dialogue, and trying to get to a place where that's not on my in front of me, so that I can then begin to invent something which has the possibility of being out of time in some interesting way, and therefore resonating with different people in different situations in different periods. That's really what the ambition for me is, because that's really what makes the novel an incredible art form, is that it really I think of it as a machine for meaning, right? So that if you think of a novel, more than, let's say, 100,000 words, but there's thousands and thousands of elements of craft. When you add up all the different images or the conversations or the thematic elements and the allegories and the allusions and the little bits of poetry and the whatever, you can go and I go on and on and on about all the various elements that make up a novel. Well, a well-crafted novel, it feels like all that belongs there, this enormously intricate array of elements. That it feels like it all belongs there, that the book is just as long as it should be, it doesn't end too soon, it doesn't overdo it, and all the parts play their role. But, and it's satisfying, but this loose array of elements, what that allows is for all kinds of different readers from different backgrounds, different genders, races, religions, ages, classes, and over time, to enter the world of the narrative and to start to assemble meaning for themselves through some kind of comparison of the different elements that speak to them, and they come out of it saying, what this book is really about is X. And all of you could have a completely different answer to what it's about, and you could prove it. You could point to the various elements in the book that support that position, and then you might elaborate on that through your own experience or what you've witnessed in life or what you remember or what have you. And so that's the beautiful thing about the novel. And that's really where I'm aiming for, is to have a book that can do that. So when I say that, is that when you're trying to write something that's timeless, what you hope is that the story could find its timeliness in unpredictable ways in the future, right? And so that was like a crazy one. Like I didn't anticipate that,
Thank God.
I didn't anticipate that, And so, but it was a lovely, COVID wasn't lovely, but what was lovely was to receive people sending me, messages about how the book helped them through some aspect of COVID, and of course that's a very satisfying thing to know that the invention then could resonate with somebody in some places in a different part of the world in a way that was material to them.
Under completely unimaginable circumstances,
Yeah, totally.
no less. That's amazing. So I also had asked folks on Instagram if they had any questions for you, and we heard from Mariama, who wanted to know if there are any hotels or hotel bars that evoke Metropole vibes because they want to visit.
Because they want to visit, okay.
Yeah.
Well,
I thought it was a good question.
The good news is that the Metropole was built around 1905, and it was built dead on in the tradition of the grand hotels. So between roughly 1890 and 1920, grand hotels were being built all over Europe, Latin America, the United States. Every major city had one, at least. And they all kind of shared many attributes. So, they would have a grand lobby. They were usually a whole square block in size. They would have a giant, lobby with, palm trees and, uniformed staff, a restaurant that served international cuisine, an American bar, that's what they called them as early as in 1910 or 1915 was, an American bar. And they might have shops. Most of them had shops on the ground. You would enter, the shops would go around the lobby in essence, so that you could enter the shops from the street or from the inside of the hotel. And of course, there were high services and beautiful fixtures and all that kinds of stuff. So, the grand hotels, interestingly, for those who study commerce, if you think about all the things that were kind of invented as businesses in 1900 or 1910, the vast majority of them are gone. Right, they've been replaced by all other kinds of businesses. Retail has completely been refashioned, and whatever media has completely been refashioned, and journalism is being refashioned now. Whatever, but the Grand Hotels survived in most cities. At least one did. So you can kind of go to any capital in Europe, and you can just ask, what is the large Grand Hotel that survives from 100 years ago, and you can go there, and they tend to have maintained many of the attributes that made them so glamorous at the time. So they still exist. Go drink. 100%.
So we have talked about timelessness. We've talked about themes. We got a lot of questions from the audience also about the settings that you choose. And it was Jean who said specifically that they're always so specific and rich in detail, and wanted to know if you visit location. I mean, did you get to have an excuse of visiting all the Grand Hotels in Europe before writing Gentleman in Moscow?
So, this is a little odd, but I'm not a big research-driven writer, and many of you who've seen me speak before probably know that, but I do like to imagine as much of the story as I can without relying on some kind of external research, whether that's the internet or books or conversations or visits. But what I'll tend to do is I'll do some of that at the end of having written the first draft. So in the case of Gentleman in Moscow, I had never set foot in the Metropole Hotel when I wrote that book. But then when I finished the first draft, I flew to Moscow and moved into the hotel and spent 10 days there beginning to revise the book inside the hotel. And similarly, I had never been to Nebraska or on the Lincoln Highway when I wrote the Lincoln Highway. And when I finished the first draft, I flew to Nebraska. I rented a car, and I went out to the middle of the state and began working my way east on the Lincoln Highway.
Wow.
And so I like to do this after the fact,
That doesn't seem super efficient.
Oh, yeah, yeah. The reason and you're absolutely right, but the reason it works for me, is because if I want it to be a holistic. I want to be able to see it in my head, to imagine it in my head, and I don't want sort of the reality to sort of dictate how I piece that together. And I think it's I can deliver it to the reader more strongly if I've started by imagining it fully myself. And here's another one that's sort of relative to this is even Hollywood. So half of this book is the 6 New York stories, most of which they are set around the year 2000. But half of the book is a single piece. It's a novella of over 200 pages called Eve in Hollywood. And the history there is that Eve is a character from Rules of Civility, as many of you know. She was Katie's best friend. And in that book, sort of 2/3 of the way through the novel, she has had a relationship that's been fallen apart. She's been in an accident where she's disfigured. She's a beautiful, sort of spunky, very independent-minded woman. She's terrific. And she is headed home to Indiana because she's like, I'm done with New York. And her parents are meeting her at Union Station here in Chicago. They've come from Indiana to pick her up. And she doesn't get off the train. They wait. She never shows. And they eventually track down the conductor. And the conductor says, you know what? She as we were approaching Chicago, she extended her ticket and went to Hollywood, went to Los Angeles in 1938. And so, which is very true to her character. And when Rules of Civility was done, I didn't want to tell you anything more about Katie or Tinker, but I couldn't stop thinking about Eve and like what did she do in Hollywood in 1938? And so 10 years ago, I wrote sort of this little thing, 60 pages. It's a little glimpse of her arrival in Los Angeles from 6 perspectives. You sort of see the first person is a retired homicide detective on the train who witnesses her extending the ticket. And is like, why would a woman do that? Like, that's really interesting to him. And he gets curious, and then eventually they have a conversation, and that kind of begins things. And then you kind of meet several people who she encounters and who she affects, and we kind of learn about her arrival in this new life through them. And when I handed in the manuscript for this to my editor, that was it. It was the 60 pages. And I sent the manuscript in, and the minute I did, I said, you know what, you got to send it back. You got to send it back, because it's not, I know so much more about what happens to Eve in Los Angeles, and the reader deserves to know that. Eve deserves for me to tell you that. And when she arrives in Los Angeles, the first thing she does is she moves into the Beverly Hills Hotel. So when I decided, okay, I'm not going to finish with the 60 pages. I am going to expand on it. The first thing I did is I flew out to Los Angeles and I moved into the Beverly Hills Hotel, because that's the kind of sacrifice I am willing to make for my art.
You're a good sport.
But then I sat down and I was like, okay, here we go, and then I began to let it really unfold, and it ends up being this 200-page work, and it's, I think it's a lot of fun.
Oh, it's great. It is a lot of fun. So, is it true that your first book wasn't published until you were in your late 40s? Is that accurate?
That is true, yes.
So Peter had wanted to know what the biggest difference was in how you understand what it means to be a writer between now and when you very first started out and dreamed of becoming one, which I thought was a really lovely question.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Because I was writing fiction as a kid, and I wrote it in high school and in college. I went to graduate school on a fiction writing grant. I had stories published in the Paris Review when I was 25. So much of what I love about fiction and much of what I know about the craft, I did know by the time I was 25. I mean, I know I'm better at it now, I think. So that kind of is the love of it, the sort of the insight about how it might work or whatever. I think there is a maturity to it. And I guess probably the biggest maturity for me is around process. Where I think this is probably true in any field that we're in, right? If you're a surgeon for long enough, if you're an English teacher for long enough, you're probably there for the same reason. You love certain aspects of it, but you get a better and better understanding about what works well and how you should approach it, and where you should start and where you should, and what you have confidence in, what you should be worried about. You get, I think, the nature of maturity is that you sort of gain command of it, and that certainly happened to me. So like a big one. And this was a big learning experience. In my 30s, I wrote a novel over 7 years that I didn't like in the end. And so I never even submitted that to an agent or for publication. But I learned a lot from that. And the biggest thing I learned is that I'm an outliner. And I've kind of shared with you some of the reasons why. My notion of a novel being a machine for meaning and being this holistic experience where all the parts speak to each other, being a planner makes that much more feasible as a goal, whereas starting with nothing and just sort of seeing where it goes, much harder to achieve that. But I'll make so that was a part of the maturation. I'm much more dedicated to sort of the specifics of the process than I was as a younger writer. But here's the counterintuitive part about that, which is that the reason, we kind of know in contemporary science that the two hemispheres of the brain tend to serve different functions for us in our daily lives, or are weighted at least, right? So we have the right side of the brain and the left side of the brain. The left side of the brain is the more analytical side, and it's process and problem solving and all those kinds of things, whereas the right side of the brain is more tuned into the subconscious, to the poetic instincts, to metaphor and imagination and all these other elements, and the two different sides kind of work differently in different experiences. Well, what I've discovered for me is that if I outline, the more carefully I outline, what that allows is for the right side, the imaginative and poetic and subconscious side of my brain, to take over when I'm actually writing a chapter. Because picture it, writing a chapter where you don't know what's going to happen. And so you have to you're making it up. Okay, so so-and-so is going to come. He's going to walk in the room. Wait, who's the guy? What's his name? Why is he here? What's the room look like? What are they going to argue about? What happens next? It's all this kind of little sort of practical problem solving that has to be done. What's his name? What's the desk? What era is the desk from? Blah, blah, blah. And so the more of that has to be done while I'm writing the chapter, the more that's magnifying the influence of the analytical side of the brain in that moment and diminishing the influence of the poetic side. So by outlining it, I know all those things that are going to happen. And what that allows me to do is to really hand the keys over to the poetic and imaginative side, where I can allow, where the image surprises me, the word sequence surprises me, what the character observes surprises me, all within the context of the events that I've already know.
That's really cool.
Thank
I
you.
love that.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to warn you ahead of time this time. We're going to do a fake goodbye, and I'm going to read the show credits, and then we can move on to the signing and do the real
I love
goodbye.
all this fake stuff. This is great. Okay.
Well, Amor, thank you so much for joining me for Nerdette Book Club this month. It was a real pleasure to talk
Greta,
with you.
it was so great to be on the show. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Perfect. Nerdette is produced by me and Anna Bauman at WBEZ in Chicago and is part of the NPR network. And our executive producer is Brendan Banaszak. Many special thanks to Eddie Madrano and the rest of the WBEZ events team for helping put this event on. I also just want to take a really quick moment before we get to signing. I know all of you probably know that I am one of the people who will be laid off by WBEZ at the end of May. And I just wanted to take, there's no need for that, I just wanted to take a really quick moment to say I first started at the station as a temporary employee in 2011. I was the weekend anchor, and I've gotten to do a number of different jobs at the station over these past 13 years. And it's been such an honor and just a dream and a pleasure to get to do events like this one with people like you, for people like you. So I just want to say thank you. And thank you.
So
Enjoy getting to meet you.
I have one more thing that I want to say. Can I
Oh,
say?
okay.
Is that all right?
Sure.
Are we shifting to
We have
to
3
wrapping?
minutes.
I'm going to run a little late.
Okay.
I'll pay for your parking or whatever.
Oh.
No, I wanted to share one thing with you. So first of all, we live. It's one of the interesting things about our times is that that we sort of as readers, we have come to expect or even demand more factual accuracy from our novelists than from our presidential candidates.
Ooh. Oh, I didn't know we were going here. I'm not laid off yet.
Which is crazy when you think about it. You know what I mean? You get something, you get a fact wrong in a novel, and somebody's immediately sending you an email. And so, no, that wasn't there, it was there, or whatever. And that's fine. But what I want to talk about something, a bigger sort of topic, which is how do I think about the role of history in my work? That's what I want to share with you. And the best way for me to share this is through analogy. And the analogy is that you are all at the theater, and let's say you're here to see a Chekhov play, and it's the Cherry Orchard. Now, so what you're looking at across the stage is a fancy sort of living room in a house in the Russian countryside, an estate in the Russian countryside in the late 19th century. Now, across the room are a pair of French doors, and through the French doors, in the distance, you can see the cherry orchard. It's spring, the orchard's in bloom, so you can see the white and pink blossoms in the distance. Now, of course, what you're looking at when you look through the French doors is painted canvas, because that's the way a stage crew is going to prepare that. They're going to paint the orchard on the canvas and drop it behind the French doors, and that's what you're going to look at. Now, when they do that, they will not paint it in a hyper-realist style. They will paint it in an impressionist style, like Renoir or Monet. And that makes sense, because to the naked eye, as we look across the stage in the distance, if it were painted in a hyper-realist style, that would look strange. Whereas in that sort of slightly blurry impressionist quality, that fits. Now, in addition, impressionist style has that sort of virtue of almost giving us a sense of movement, that we can almost, as if we can see the movement of the blossoms in the afternoon light, in the light breeze, right? All right, so now in front of that, on either side of the French doors, we have bookcases made out of plywood and painted to look like mahogany. And over here is a staircase that goes nowhere, and over here is a door that goes to nothing, right? But now in the middle is an actual table surrounded by actual chairs, and on the table is an actual China tea service. And it's very important that these things be actual. Because let's say what's happening in this scene is that there's a young woman sitting at the table having tea by herself, and the brother comes through the door, slams the door, and marches across the stage, and he's clearly in high emotion. And when he sits, we want to hear the legs of the chair scraping across the wooden surface of the stage as he pulls himself up to the table. And when, as he is communicating with his sister in high emotion, he pauses to slap the door in emphasis. We want to hear the physicality of his palm on the surface of the table. And when she, who's been listening very patiently, sets down her teacup, we want to hear that delicate clink of the porcelain hitting the porcelain. So I say it's very important that these things be real because they kind of sharpen our focus on what's transpiring there in the middle of the stage between the actors. All right, now this is exactly the way my work is constructed. And for me, history is the painted backdrop, right? And when I do it in an impressionist style, not in a hyperrealist style. Because it's there to give you a sense of time, a sense of place, a sense of mood, but that's it. Now in front of that in my work is a lot of plywood that's painted to look like mahogany. And this is the stuff where when you read it, you're like, wait, did that really happen? And the fact that you can't quite tell whether a weird thing that actually happened might be made up, or a made-up thing that seems really right might be real, like that's great. I'm quite happy that you can't quite make that distinction. All right, but in front of all that in my work is the table and chairs. And I want that to be very real to you. I want it to be so real that you feel like you are sitting at that table, so that you can watch as the brother and sister talk, and that you can see the shifts in their expressions. You can hear the nuances in their tones of voice as they exchange their ideas and sentiments. And I want that to feel very real to you, because that's where the action is. Thank you very much, everybody.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Coming down. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, WBEZ.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greta. Thank you, crowd.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bookends and Beginnings.